Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The first thing I noticed was the silence behind the noise. Not the kind of silence you get at night when traffic calms down. This was a hollow, wrong quiet, like a building after the power gets cut and the air handling units stop. You still hear things, sure. A far-off siren. A dog that won't stop barking, but the normal background layer is missing, the layer your brain depends on to feel like the world is steady. It was mid-morning when I realized the day had snapped in half. I was on the north side of Philadelphia, off Roosevelt Boulevard, headed toward an industrial supply house near the rail yards because I'd promised I'd pick up a replacement pressure gauge and some half-inch stainless bolts. My job title was maintenance technician, but maintenance is a wide word. In practice, I fixed what broke, inspected what might break, and kept records that proved we'd done both. I worked contract jobs all over the region: water facilities, fuel depots, chemical plants, food processing lines, anything with rotating equipment and piping. That morning, my phone kept losing service. It would show bars, then none, then bars again. Group messages came through in clusters like someone was dumping a bucket of words into the network every few minutes. Half the messages were rumors. The other half were people telling each other to stop spreading rumors. I'd already seen 2 wrecks that didn't make sense. Not normal fender benders. Cars parked at angles like they'd been abandoned mid-turn, driver doors hanging open, no one nearby. The second one had a SEPTA bus stopped crooked at the curb with its hazard lights blinking like it was trying to apologize. And then I saw a man walking down the shoulder with his shoes missing. He wasn't stumbling like he was drunk. He was walking like he was tired and stubborn, like he'd decided he would make it somewhere even if his body didn't agree. His socks were dark at the toes. He turned his head as I passed, and his face had the blankness of somebody who'd been awake too long. I should have stopped. That's what normal people do when they see someone who looks unwell. But the hair on my arms lifted. Something in my chest tightened. I kept driving. The industrial supply house was closed. The roll-up door was down and padlocked, and there was a handwritten sign taped to the glass. Closed until further notice. The paper flapped in the wind, and it hit me how fast further notice can become never. My contract supervisor called while I was sitting in the parking lot staring at that sign. "Daniel," he said, and he didn't sound like himself. "Where are you?" "Roosevelt," I said. "Supply place is shut." "Forget it. Head back south. Do not go downtown. They're shutting bridges. There's something going on at hospitals." "Like what?" He took a breath. "People are attacking staff. It's not one place, it's multiple." I didn't laugh. I didn't say that's impossible. Because I could hear something in his voice that told me he'd already stepped past disbelief and into decision-making. "What do you want me to do?" I asked. "I want you to get somewhere you can lock a door, and I want you to stay there." I looked at my windshield, at the thin film of dust on the dashboard, at the sun turning everything too bright. "My apartment is south. I can make—" "No," he cut in. "Traffic is stacking. Interstates are jammed. Use back roads. Avoid crowds." I started to ask him what this was exactly. Then my phone signal dropped hard and the call ended mid-sentence. I sat there another 10 seconds with the phone in my hand, waiting for the network to decide if I still existed. A message came through from my sister in South Philly. 1 sentence. "Are you safe?" I typed, "I'm okay. Where are you?" It didn't send. I tried again. No send. I started the truck. My work vehicle was a white pickup with toolboxes in the bed and a sticker that said, "Contractor" in block letters. It was not subtle. Subtle suddenly felt valuable. I drove away from the closed supply house and took side streets. I avoided intersections where people had started to gather. I passed a corner store with the metal gate halfway down, and a man in a reflective vest shouting at someone I couldn't see. The radio was a mess. Stations cutting in and out, emergency tones, voices talking too fast. Words like quarantine, unknown, do not approach. The kind of language they use when they're trying to sound calm while admitting they don't control the situation. I turned the radio off because it was making my hands sweat. That's when I saw my first one up close. At a red light, a woman stepped off the curb into traffic. Not a purposeful crosswalk step, a drift. Her arms hung loose and her head tilted slightly, like she was listening to something inside her skull. A car honked, long and angry. She didn't even flinch. The car swerved around her. She turned toward the sound. Her mouth opened. No scream came out. At least, not that I could hear through closed windows. It was like she was trying to inhale the noise. Her face looked normal from a distance. Then I noticed the dried mess on her chin, the stiffness in her neck, the way her eyes didn't focus on the car the way a normal person's eyes do. They slid across it like the car was just weather. The light turned green. I drove through. I told myself she was sick, high fever, drugs, shock, anything that fit in the old world. 2 blocks later, I passed an ambulance stopped at the curb. 2 EMTs were half dragging a man toward the back doors. The man's legs kicked hard like he was fighting, but it wasn't coordinated, it was reflexive. One EMT slipped in something on the pavement and nearly fell. The other yelled, and the yell had panic in it. The man snapped his head sideways and lunged. I didn't see details. I saw the sudden violence of motion, the EMT's arms going up, the other EMT stumbling back. I drove on, heart hammering, throat dry. I didn't go home. Home was an apartment with windows, neighbors, and thin walls. Home was a place where noise carries and questions knock. If something was spreading, home was a place that would become crowded and desperate fast. I drove toward a site I knew like muscle memory, a decommissioned facility along the Schuylkill River, an old pumping and transfer campus that used to handle fuel and industrial water for nearby operations, back when everything on the river had been a moving part in a bigger machine. The place was fenced, posted with no trespassing signs, but in the last year the gates had been left unsecured more than once. I'd been there during a survey for a potential demolition contract. I knew where the cameras were supposed to be, I knew which ones didn't work, and I knew about the passage. It wasn't a pretty tunnel, it wasn't a secret bunker. It was a functional underground corridor designed to move people and pipes from one building to another without exposing them to weather, or to curious eyes, or to hazards on the surface. In some places, it was a pipe chase. In other places, it widened into a service corridor you could walk upright. It had been used to access pump skids, valves, and manifolds, equipment that had been removed when the system shut down. What remained was narrow, ugly, and defensible. The closer I got to the river, the more the city felt like it was bracing. A line of cars stuck behind an intersection where the traffic lights were out. People leaning out windows, shouting. A man with a baseball bat standing in the middle of the road like he was directing his own emergency. I turned down a side street and cut behind warehouses. I kept moving until the buildings got more spaced out, until weeds pushed through cracks in concrete, until the air smelled like wet metal. The facility sat behind a sagging chain-link fence topped with bent barbed wire. A sign with faded letters still read, "Transfer and Pump Station. Authorized personnel only." I was not authorized anymore. I parked behind a concrete barrier where the truck wouldn't be visible from the road. I took a minute to inventory what I had, because the brain likes lists when it's scared. A tool bag, a hard hat, safety glasses, work gloves, a half-face respirator with organic vapor cartridges still in its bag, 2 headlamps, a handheld flashlight, spare batteries. a folding utility knife, a small first aid kit, 2 bottles of water, a box of energy bars I kept for long jobs. And in the lockbox under my seat, the only thing I'd ever felt mildly silly carrying until that morning. A compact pistol with 2 magazines. Legal. Locked. Not a movie weapon. Just a last resort I hoped I would never need. I clipped the keys to a carabiner on my belt. I slung the tool bag over one shoulder and the respirator bag over the other. I did not put the hard hat on because hard hats make you look like someone who belongs somewhere, and I had a feeling belonging was about to be dangerous. The fence had a section where the bottom was lifted, probably from people crawling under to explore or steal copper. I got down and slid through, careful not to tear my clothes on the wire. Inside, the facility looked like a paused project. Concrete pads. Empty steel frames where equipment had been removed. A pump house with boarded windows. An electrical building with a rusted door and a warning sticker about high voltage. There was graffiti, but not much. This wasn't a popular hangout. It was too far from convenience, too close to the river, too full of places to fall and get hurt. I walked with my head angled, listening. Somewhere far off, a siren rose and then cut out mid-wail. The pump passage entrance was behind the pump house, half hidden by overgrown shrubs. It looked like a service hatch, rectangular, steel, with a handle that used to accept a padlock. The padlock was long gone. The handle was stiff with rust. I pulled. It didn't move. I set my tool bag down, grabbed a small pry bar, and worked it into the seam. Rust flakes fell like old scabs. I leaned my weight into it. The hatch groaned, then lifted an inch. The smell hit immediately. Damp concrete, stagnant water, and the faint chemical sourness of old fuel residue. Not enough to knock you down, but enough to tell you this was not a place you wanted to breathe deeply without thinking. I paused, pulled my respirator from its bag, and fitted it over my face. The cartridges were marked for organic vapors. Better than nothing. I did a quick seal check by covering the intakes with my hands and inhaling gently. The mask pulled toward my face. Good. I lifted the hatch fully and propped it with the pry bar so it wouldn't slam shut. A ladder descended into darkness. I clicked on my headlamp and started down. The air got cooler after the first few rungs. The concrete walls were close enough that my shoulders felt them. The ladder ended on a graded platform, and below the grating I could see water. Standing water in a sump area, still as black glass. I stepped off the ladder and onto the platform. The passage stretched out in 2 directions. To the left, it narrowed quickly into a pipe chase. To the right, it widened into a service corridor about 4 feet wide and maybe 7 feet high, with brackets on the wall where pipes used to run. I went right. The floor was concrete with patches of flaking paint. A few inches of water covered parts of it, shallow enough to splash but deep enough to hide debris. I moved slowly, testing each step. As I walked, my headlamp beam picked up details. Bolt holes where pipe supports had been cut. Stenciled numbers on the wall, faded but readable in spots. A handrail bolted to the wall, rusted. Every 20 feet or so there was a valve station. An old valve body still in place, with the handwheel removed. Just the stem and the bonnet, like a tooth pulled and left half in the gum. Whoever dismantled the system had taken everything with resale value, but they'd left what was too integrated to bother with. That was useful. A narrow corridor is defensible if you can control how someone moves through it. A narrow corridor becomes a trap if you get trapped. I needed to know every exit, every turn, every place the passage connected to the surface. I also needed to know whether there were pockets of bad air. I didn't have a calibrated gas meter. On job sites we used multi-gas monitors, oxygen, carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, lower explosive limit. Without that, you're guessing. But I wasn't completely blind. There were clues. The air didn't burn my eyes. My breathing felt normal through the respirator. Oh, the smell was consistent, not suddenly stronger. And the passage had old vent ducts, square metal trunks that ran along the ceiling, with louvers every so often. They were probably dead, but dead ducts still allow passive airflow if there's any connection to the surface. I reached the first junction after about 100 yards. A doorway, no door, leading to a wider chamber. My headlamp revealed the ghost of machinery. Bolt patterns on the floor, conduit runs, a raised concrete pad that used to hold a pump skid. On the far wall, there was a sign with faded lettering. Pump gallery. No entry without permit. Confined space. The words tightened something in my stomach. Confined space means people have died in places like this. It means rules exist because bodies taught them. I stepped into the pump gallery carefully. There was a ladder on the wall leading up to another hatch. That hatch was closed, and from below I could see light bleeding around its edges. An exit to the surface, good. I didn't open it, not yet. Light means visibility, and visibility works both ways. In the corner of the gallery, half submerged in water, I saw something white that didn't belong. A hard hat. I crouched and picked it up. The plastic was scuffed, and on the front there was a faded sticker, a contractor logo I didn't recognize. Inside, the suspension straps were stiff with age. There was also a clipboard, its paper swollen and warped from moisture. Most of the writing was illegible, but one line stood out, written in thick marker, protected under a plastic cover. Do not energize. Incident investigation pending. My pulse quickened. This wasn't just a normal shutdown. This place had been stopped abruptly at some point. I set the clipboard down and backed out of the gallery. I kept going down the main corridor, following it deeper. After another stretch, I found another side chamber and then another. Some had ladders up. Some ended in dead walls. Some had old valve manifolds still connected to short sections of pipe that disappeared into the concrete. In one spot, the ceiling lowered and the corridor narrowed. Pipes that had once been removed left behind jagged stubs. I had to duck and turn sideways to pass. That narrow point made my brain click into planning mode. If I had to defend this place, that choke point would matter. I turned around and walked back, counting my steps, watching the walls. I found 2 anchor points on either side, old pipe brackets bolted into the concrete. They were still solid, rusty but solid. I could rig something here, a barrier, a gate, something that would slow movement and make noise. Noise was both enemy and ally. Noise attracts trouble, but it also warns you when trouble is moving. My headlamp beam swung over something on the wall. A rusted metal box with a broken glass window. An emergency phone, maybe. Above it, faded letters said, "Pull for alarm." I tugged gently. Nothing happened. The cable was dead. Still, the presence of alarm systems meant the passage connected to something important once. I reached the ladder near the entrance and climbed halfway up to listen. The world above was not quiet. I heard distant shouting, car horns, a siren that cut in and out. But nothing right on top of me. No footsteps near the hatch. I climbed back down and made my decision. This would be my hideout. At least for now. Underground, out of sight, with limited entry points. A place I could fortify with the tools and materials already here. But a hideout is only as good as its basics: air, water, and a way out. I had water bottles, but those would last a day, maybe 2. The standing water in the sump was not safe. It could be contaminated with fuel residue, bacteria, anything washed in over the years. The facility was near the river. In theory, I could access river water and treat it. In practice, river water in an industrial zone is the definition of needs treatment. I also needed light that didn't depend entirely on batteries. I needed a way to charge things. And I needed a plan for what I would do if the passage became compromised. Before I built anything, I did the one thing that keeps people alive in unfamiliar spaces. I mapped. Not on paper, paper gets wet, paper tears. I mapped in my head and with markings on the wall using a paint marker from my tool bag. I didn't use big obvious writing, just enough for me to see if I needed to move fast. Then I checked the hatches. There were 3 main hatches to the surface that I'd found. The entrance hatch, the pump gallery hatch, and another hatch farther down near what looked like an old valve control room. I approached the far hatch first because it was the least likely to be watched. The ladder up was rusted but stable. I climbed slowly, keeping my weight centered. The hatch above had a wheel handle, like a small submarine door. It was designed to seal tight. I turned the wheel. It resisted, then moved with a screech that made my skin crawl. I stopped, waited, listened. No response. I turned it again, inch by inch, controlling the noise as best I could. Finally, the seal broke, and the hatch lifted slightly. Cold air drifted down, fresher than the passage air. I pushed it open just enough to look. It opened into a small concrete shed above ground, half collapsed on one side with weeds growing through the floor. Sunlight fell through a hole in the roof. The shed door was gone, leaving a rectangular opening to the outside. I didn't step out. I watched. Through the opening, I could see the edge of the facility yard and, beyond that, a strip of road. A car rolled by slowly, then stopped. Another car bumped it from behind, not hard enough to be a crash, more like a nudge. A person got out of the second car and started waving their arms, shouting. The person in the first car didn't respond. The person who'd gotten out walked up to the driver's window, leaned in, and then jerked back like they'd been struck. They stumbled, grabbed at the window frame, and then their body snapped forward again. I shut the hatch quietly. My hands were trembling when I climbed down. Whatever was happening up there, it was not local. It was not a single incident. It was a pattern. I went back to the choke point and started planning the first fortification. The passage gave me materials if I looked at it like a job site. There were metal grates I could unbolt from unused platforms. There were lengths of old threaded rod sticking out of walls. There were pipe flanges still attached to short spools, heavy, awkward pieces of steel that could be used as weights or barriers. There were also old valve actuators on the floor of one chamber, handwheel gearboxes that someone had discarded because they were seized. A gearbox like that is basically a dense chunk of metal with mounting holes and a shaft, useful for building a brace or a doorstop. I carried 2 of them back to the choke point, sliding them across the damp floor so I wouldn't exhaust myself. I also found an old chain hoist still hanging from an overhead beam in the pump gallery. The chain was rusty, but the hook looked intact. A chain hoist can lift hundreds of pounds if it's in decent condition. Even if it couldn't lift much anymore, the chain itself was valuable. I brought the hook end back to the choke point and anchored it through one of the old brackets. Then I ran the chain across to the opposite bracket, creating a waist-high barrier. Not a wall, not a door, but a line that would snag and slow anything trying to pass. I added noise. From my tool bag, I took a handful of washers and nuts. I tied them to the chain with electrical tape and spare wire. If the chain moved, the metal would clink. That sound would travel in the corridor. It would tell me something had touched the barrier. I made a second sound trap 10 feet behind the first, using a length of old conduit I'd found in a scrap pile. I hung it loosely from a bracket so it could swing. I taped washers to it too. 2 layers, one to warn, one to confirm. Then I did the hardest part of building a hideout. I sat down, leaned my back against the concrete wall, and forced myself to stop moving. Movement feels like control. Stillness feels like vulnerability. But if you don't rest, your brain starts making mistakes, and mistakes in a confined passage can end you quickly. I took off my respirator for a moment to drink water. The air smelled stale, but it didn't make me cough. I put the mask back on anyway. I pulled out my phone and held it up, turning slowly, searching for signal. Nothing. No bars. I opened my notes app and typed a message I couldn't send yet, because the act of writing made me feel like I was still connected to someone. I'm alive. I'm underground. I love you. I stared at the words until my eyes blurred. Then I heard something. A faint metallic scrape. Not in the passage, above it. Footsteps, slow and dragging, moving across the concrete near the entrance hatch. I froze so hard my muscles cramped. The footsteps paused. Then came a thump, like a body leaning against something. The hatch handle above me rattled once, softly. Something, or someone, was testing it. I turned off my headlamp instantly, plunging myself into darkness. I held my breath, listening to the water drip somewhere far away. The hatch rattled again. Then it stopped. Silence returned, but it wasn't comforting. It was waiting. I stayed in the dark for what felt like an hour, though it might have been 3 minutes. My chest hurt from holding my breath, so I forced myself to inhale slowly through the mask. No more sound from above. I turned my headlamp back on but kept it pointed down. That was my first proof that the passage wasn't just a shelter. It was a shelter with a countdown. I needed to reinforce the entrance hatch from below. The hatch was steel and it opened upward. That meant if something above could get fingers under it, it might pry it open. But if I could brace it from below, I could prevent it from moving. I climbed the ladder, stopped 2 rungs below the hatch, and studied the underside. There was a lip around the frame. There were bolt holes where a locking bar might once have been installed. Bolt holes are opportunities. I climbed back down and went hunting. In the pump gallery, I found a length of angle iron leaning against a wall, half submerged. It was heavy but manageable. I dragged it back to the ladder and tested it against the hatch frame. With a little adjustment, it fit across the underside of the hatch like a crossbar. I needed a way to wedge it in place. I used one of the valve gearboxes as a base block on the platform, then set the angle iron against the hatch lip and pressed the other end down onto the gearbox. It created a crude brace. Hatch pushing down would press into the bar would press into the heavy gearbox would press into the platform. A simple compression brace. It wasn't perfect, but it meant the hatch couldn't easily lift unless something moved 100 pounds of metal out of the way. I tightened the setup by adding a second piece of scrap steel as a shim, then taped the contact points to reduce vibration noise if the hatch got rattled again. Tape isn't magic, but it can stop a telltale clink that gives away your position. When I finished, sweat ran down my back even in the cool air. I climbed down and sat again. That's when I noticed something I'd missed in the pump gallery, a door. Not a hatch, not an opening. A real steel door set into the concrete wall, with a handle and a latch. It was painted safety yellow once, but the paint was peeling. A sign on it read, "Archive, Incident Files, Authorized Access Only." My eyes stayed on that sign. The clipboard I'd found. The warning not to energize. The confined space permit sign. This passage hadn't just been decommissioned for budget reasons. It had been shut down after something went wrong. And if I was going to live down here, I needed to know what kind of wrong. I walked to the door and tried the handle. Locked. Of course. But the lock was old. And I was, professionally speaking, very good at opening old things that didn't want to open. I set down my tool bag, pulled out a flat screwdriver and a small pry tool, and got to work. The first attempt was gentle. The second was less gentle. The lock gave with a sharp snap that echoed down the passage like a gunshot. I froze, waiting for a response. Nothing. I eased the door open. Inside was a small room with metal shelving and a desk bolted to the floor. The air smelled like paper and mold, not fuel. My headlamp beam swept across binders and folders and plastic totes. A filing cabinet sat against the wall, its drawers half open. On the desk was an old emergency light, the kind with a built-in battery, and beside it a red binder with a label. Serious incident. Pump passage. Final report. My throat tightened again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the feeling you get when you realize the place you chose as a refuge has its own history, and that history can still reach up and grab you. I pulled the binder closer and opened it carefully, like it might crumble. The first page was a summary, typed and copied, the ink faded but readable. I read the heading twice. Incident date, May 14, 2009. Location, underground pump passage, valve control section. Type, atmospheric hazard, oxygen deficiency and volatile vapor. I swallowed. Oxygen deficiency means one breath can drop you. Volatile vapor means one spark can ruin your day. The report described a maintenance crew entering the passage to check a suspected leak. The pumps had been shut down for repair, but the lines still held residue. A section had been isolated with valves, but one valve was leaking internally, passing product into a dead leg, a section of pipe with nowhere to go. Over time, vapors accumulated in a low point. The crew entered without continuous monitoring. The report didn't call them reckless. It called them non-compliant with the revised confined space procedures. That's corporate language for somebody skipped steps. One worker collapsed. A second worker went in to help and collapsed too. A supervisor tried to pull them out and was overcome. 3 people down in under a minute. The only reason anyone survived was because a 4th person did what training says to do. He didn't go in. He called for rescue. He forced the fire department to treat it like a confined space rescue, not a normal pullout. I sat back on my heels, binder in my hands, and let that sink in. This passage had killed people without any monsters, without any outbreak, just by being what it was. A closed space with invisible hazards. And now I was sitting inside it voluntarily. I flipped deeper into the report. There were diagrams of the passage sections, ventilation notes, recommendations. One recommendation was highlighted. Install passive vent stacks at hatch locations. Passive vent stacks. That explained the ducts. That explained why the air didn't feel instantly wrong. After the incident, someone had tried to make the place safer, even if it was being shut down. Another page listed the reason the passage was ultimately decommissioned. System obsolescence and unacceptable risk profile. In plain language, too old, too dangerous, too expensive to fix. I closed the binder slowly. This information was a gift and a warning. It meant I needed airflow. It meant I needed to treat every low spot as a potential vapor pocket. It meant I needed to avoid open flames, avoid sparks, and keep my electrical use controlled. It also meant something else. If I could control airflow and access, I could make this passage safer for me and more dangerous for anything that tried to enter. Not with fire, not with anything flashy, but with simple reality, narrow spaces, barriers, and the fact that not everyone can move intelligently in the dark. I put the binder back in the red tote and carried it to my living area near the choke point. I chose that spot because it was between the entrance and the deeper hatches. It gave me options. I set up a temporary base. A plastic pallet I'd found became a sleeping platform, keeping me off the cold floor. I used an old tarp, damp but intact, as a ground sheet. I lined my tools along the wall in the order I'd want them. Light sources, cutting tools, pry tools, tape, fasteners. I drank water sparingly. Then I waited. Above, the world continued to fracture. I heard vehicles sometimes, distant and erratic. I heard shouting at least twice, and once I heard what might have been a single gunshot far away. Hard to tell in a city that already has sharp noises. The entrance hatch rattled again around mid-afternoon. This time, it rattled hard. The brace held. The angle iron vibrated, the gearbox block shifted a fraction, and the sound carried down the ladder like a drum. I killed my headlamp and moved to the choke point. Pistol in hand but held low, not pointed, because pointing at darkness doesn't help unless you have a target. The chain barrier trembled slightly, then stilled. Footsteps on the ladder. Slow, scraping. Someone was coming down. I held my breath again, forcing my body to stay calm. My heart wanted to sprint. My muscles wanted to run at the sound. But you don't run in a narrow passage with unknown air and unknown exits. You hold. A shape appeared at the bottom of the ladder, outlined by faint daylight from the hatch above. A head, shoulders, a body moving awkwardly. The person stepped onto the platform. They paused as if confused by the brace, by the darkness, by the fact that the world didn't immediately offer them a clear path. My headlamp was off, but my eyes had adjusted enough to see movement. The person's posture was wrong. The head hung forward. The arms drooped. The movements were not cautious. They were drifting, like a machine with failing guidance. Then the person made a sound. Not a word. A wet, strained exhale, like someone breathing through a blocked airway. They took a step forward. I backed up one pace, staying silent, letting them come into the passage rather than me moving towards them. The chain barrier at the choke point was still far down the corridor. This person was in the open section near the entrance with space to move. I needed them to commit to the corridor. They took another step, and then another, drawn by something, sound, smell, airflow I didn't know. When they reached the corridor proper, their foot splashed in shallow water. The splash echoed. They paused. And then, like a switch had flipped, their head snapped up and they started moving faster. Not running, but purposeful. Toward me. I lifted the pistol, not to aim at them like a movie hero, but to have it ready if the distance collapsed too quickly. My other hand found my flashlight, thumb resting on the switch. The figure kept coming, mouth working soundlessly, feet slapping water. I clicked the flashlight on and aimed it at their chest, not their eyes. The light revealed a man in a torn work shirt, soaked from the waist down, his skin pale under grime. His eyes were open but empty, and his face was streaked with dried residue I didn't want to identify too closely. His hands were held slightly forward as if he was reaching for balance. He saw the light and surged. I stepped back again, leading him down the corridor. He followed. This was the moment where everything becomes real. Not on the news, not in rumors, but in the space between you and a moving body. I reached the choke point. The chain barrier was set at waist height, with washers and nuts taped to it. I slipped under it smoothly because I knew it was there. The man did not. He hit it chest first. Metal clinked loud in the corridor. He grabbed at the chain, fingers curling, pulling. The chain held. It bit into his hands. He kept pulling anyway, not reacting to pain like a normal person would. The second sound trap clinked too as his movement vibrated the brackets. I kept backing up until I had distance and a clear line of sight. My mind ran through options fast. I did not want to fire in a confined passage if I didn't have to. Sound carries. Sound invites. I also did not want that man getting past my barrier. I looked to my left where a side chamber opened. In that chamber I had staged a heavy pipe spool with flanges, balanced on edge like a wheel. A heavy piece of steel. A lever. A controlled drop. I moved sideways into the chamber, staying out of the corridor's direct line. I grabbed the pipe spool with both hands, braced my legs, and rolled it to the edge of the chamber opening. The man was still fighting the chain, rattling it, making noise like a whole crew of people could hear. I waited until he leaned forward, until his head and shoulders were close to the barrier. Then I tipped the pipe spool. It rolled out of the chamber and dropped hard onto the corridor floor, slamming into the chain barrier supports, not breaking them but shifting the chain lower. The man stumbled as the chain changed position. His feet slipped in the water. He went down on his side. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victory. I felt the cold clarity of cause and effect. He thrashed, trying to get up, but the chain and the lowered angle made it awkward. He was tangled. I moved forward one step, staying behind the barrier, and said the only thing that came to my mind: "Stop." It meant nothing to him. His mouth opened, and he made that strained exhale again. His hands clawed at the chain. I stepped back, because that's when I heard something else. Not in the passage. Above it. More footsteps near the entrance hatch. More than one. And I understood in a sudden wave of cold that this wasn't just a single wandering person finding a hole in the ground. This was a leak in my defenses. This was the beginning of a problem that grows. I shut off my flashlight and moved deeper into the passage, away from the corridor, away from the noise, carrying the red binder like it was a manual for staying alive. Behind me, the chain barrier rattled. Above me, the hatch area thumped with weight. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, the passage waited with its own old hazards: vapors, low oxygen pockets, and dead ends that didn't care what the world looked like above. I had chosen this place because it was defensible. Now, I needed to make it survivable. And I needed to make sure the next thing that came down that ladder didn't bring the entire broken city with it. I moved deeper fast, but not fast enough to make noise. In a narrow corridor, speed is a trap. Your boot catches a bolt stub, you go down hard, and then you're fighting the floor instead of the threat. So I took quick, controlled steps, keeping one hand on the wall to guide me without sweeping my light around. Behind me, the chain barrier rattled again. The man, tangled in it, kept pulling, kept grinding metal against metal. That noise was going to act like a beacon for anything else up there. I reached the next junction and stopped in the shadow of the side chamber, breathing through the respirator slowly. Footsteps above the entrance hatch continued, dragging, then pausing, then dragging again, like whoever was up there didn't think in straight lines. I heard the hatch handle rattle, then a dull impact, like someone slamming a shoulder into it. The brace held, but I felt the vibration through the concrete. My first objective changed instantly. This wasn't about having a shelter for the night. This was about sealing the access point without making myself a prisoner. I needed an internal gate. A real barrier, not just a chain, something that could take repeated impacts and still keep bodies from entering the main corridor. Something I could open from my side if I had to leave. I went to the archive room and scanned it for anything useful. Shelving, metal desk, filing cabinets. The filing cabinet was heavy, but it was also tall and flat. If I could tip it into position, it could act as a wall segment. Then I remembered the pump gallery had a chain hoist and overhead steel. If the hoist worked even a little, I could move heavy things with leverage instead of my back. I grabbed the red incident binder and shoved it into my bag. I didn't want to lose it in the scramble. Then I went back to the pump gallery chamber with the overhead beam. The chain hoist looked rough, but the hook and load chain weren't snapped. I pulled on the hand chain gently. The mechanism groaned and moved half an inch. That was enough. I found the best candidate for an actual gate, one of the large steel grates from a raised platform near the entrance ladder. It was bolted down with rusted hardware. A grate like that is designed to hold weight and resist bending. It also has holes that let you see and hear through it, useful for awareness. I went back toward the entrance area in darkness, using my headlamp only when I had to, pointed down. The man was still caught at the chain barrier. He'd managed to get one arm partially free, but his torso was pinned by the lowered chain in the pipe spool. He kept writhing. He kept making that wet exhale sound. He didn't seem to tire. I didn't approach him. I didn't try to finish anything. I just treated him like a malfunctioning machine. Keep distance, control the environment, don't get grabbed. The entrance ladder I kept low and listened. The hatch was still being tested from above. I heard a long scrape, then a thump. Multiple sets of feet. I chose a location for the internal gate about 20 feet into the main corridor from the ladder platform before the choke point. That gave me room to work and a second layer of defense if something slipped inside. Now I needed the grate. I turned my headlamp on low and unbolted the grate from the platform supports. The bolts fought me. I used penetrating oil from my kit, waited, then used a longer wrench for leverage. The bolt heads rounded on 2 of them. I cursed silently and used a hacksaw blade to cut the remaining bolt shanks. The grate came free with a metallic pop. It was heavier than it looked. Steel always is. I dragged it along the wet floor, keeping it flat so it didn't clatter. At the chosen gate position, I propped the grate upright across the corridor. It wasn't tall enough to reach the ceiling. There was a gap above it. Not safe. I needed a top section. I went to the scrap pile in the valve control chamber and found another smaller grate and a length of angle iron. I stacked the smaller grate above the big one like a second story, then used angle iron on both sides as uprights. I drilled into the concrete wall with a battery drill I found in my truck's toolkit, an old one I'd kept charged out of habit. I used masonry anchors and bolts to pin the uprights into place. The drill noise made my heart race. It wasn't loud like a siren, but underground. Any mechanical sound carries. I worked fast and then stopped, listening after every burst of drilling. The footsteps above the hatch didn't change, which meant that they either didn't hear or didn't care. That was worse in its own way. Once the uprights were anchored, I wired the grates to the angle iron, then added a diagonal brace using threaded rod. On the inside, my side, I built a latch, a sliding steel bar that dropped into 2 welded loops on the upright. The loops weren't perfect, but they held. I tested the gate by slamming my shoulder into it. It flexed slightly, then held. It wasn't a bank vault door, but it was a real barrier that could take repeated pressure without collapsing immediately. I added one more feature, a quiet alarm. I tied 2 washers to a thin wire and fixed the wire so it would rattle against the grate if anything pushed it. Small sound, close range, enough to wake me without echoing down the whole corridor. Now I had layers. The hatch brace, the internal gate, the choke point chain barrier farther down, and multiple escape hatches deeper in. But I still had a serious issue: air. If bodies piled at the entrance hatch and kept pressing, they could obstruct passive airflow. If the passage had any volatile residue, reduced airflow could turn stale but tolerable into dangerous. The 2009 report said the incident involved oxygen deficiency and volatile vapor accumulation in a low point. I needed to avoid creating a low oxygen pocket around me. So I moved my base deeper, closer to the valve control hatch, which had fresher air when I opened it earlier. I didn't camp directly beneath that hatch. I camped downwind of it, in the corridor where I felt a faint but steady movement of air. Then I tackled power and light. Batteries are finite. Headlamps are great, but you can't gamble your life on a handful of AA cells. From my truck, I brought down a small 12-volt jump pack and a basic inverter, something I used occasionally to power a laptop on site. I also had a compact LED work light designed for job sites. Efficient, bright, and it ran on 12 volts. I wired a simple setup, jump pack to inverter for charging small devices, and direct 12-volt to the LED work light with an inline fuse I made from spare automotive fuses. I taped connections, mounted the light low behind a wall edge so it wouldn't shine down the corridor, and used it only when needed. No open flames, no sparks, no improvising with bare wire. The next problem was water. I couldn't drink anything down here without treating it, and I couldn't stay forever on what I carried. I checked the valve control hatch again, but this time I didn't just peek. I opened it a few inches, listened, then lifted it carefully and stepped into the collapsed shed, staying low. The yard outside was tense and wrong. Cars were stopped at odd angles. One engine ran unattended, its exhaust loud in the quiet. In the distance, a figure moved between vehicles with that same drifting gait. I stayed in the shed's shadow, scanning. I couldn't risk going to the river in daylight. Too open. But I saw something better. A rainwater downspout leading into a cracked plastic cistern behind the shed. It was probably part of an old washdown system or an emergency water supply. I checked the cistern lid carefully. The smell wasn't fuel. It smelled like damp plastic and leaves. I dipped a screwdriver into the water and pulled it out. The water was tea-colored, full of sediment but not oily. No rainbow sheen. I filled one bottle anyway, just one, and carried it back down to treat. Back in the passage, I built a simple filtration chain using what I had. A clean cloth as pre-filter, then a makeshift gravity filter through layered cloth and activated carbon from a spare respirator filter cartridge I sacrificed. It wasn't perfect, it was better than nothing. Then, I disinfected with chemical tablets from my first aid kit. Basic water purification tablets I'd kept for field jobs. I waited the full time, resisting the urge to rush. When I finally drank, it tasted flat and slightly chemical. I didn't care, it was water. The first night passed in fragments. I slept in 10-minute chunks, waking to every little sound. When I woke, I listened first, then checked the gate, then checked the hatch brace by touch. Near dawn, I heard a new kind of noise. Not footsteps. A cascade of metal clinking. It came from the choke point. The trapped man had finally freed himself enough to stagger, and when he moved, the chain barrier and the washers sang out in the corridor. Then came a loud thud, followed by another, like bodies falling against something repeatedly. I held still and listened carefully. There wasn't one. There were more. Multiple impacts, irregular timing, like a crowd pressing without coordination. They'd found the entrance hatch. They'd forced it enough to make a gap. Or someone had come through another surface access and entered from somewhere else. Either way, more were in the passage now. I clicked my headlamp on low, aimed it down, and moved to the internal gate. I crouched behind it, staying off-center so I wasn't silhouetted if light came down from the entrance. Minutes passed. Then a shadow appeared at the far end of the corridor, beyond the gate, near the entrance ladder area. A figure moved into view, slow at first, then more direct, as if drawn by the faint sound of my breathing through the respirator. Another figure followed. Then another. They came in clumps, bumping into each other, scraping hands on walls, slipping on wet concrete. They didn't talk. They didn't call out. They made those strained breaths and occasional low sounds that didn't resemble language. They reached my gate. The first one pressed into it and began pushing. The grate flexed, the washers rattled softly, and my alarm wire made a faint tick. The pushing intensified. Hands slid through the grate holes, grasping, fingers curling, searching. I stayed back. This was the point where a lot of people make the wrong choice, because fear tells you to solve the problem permanently, loudly, right now. But loud solutions create bigger problems. Instead, I used the environment. I backed farther down the corridor toward the valve control chamber. In that chamber, there was a second choke point, a narrower passage with old pipe stubs and a sharp turn. I'd already staged heavy items there, 2 pipe flanges, a gearbox, a steel drum half full of debris. If the gate failed, I would fall back to that second choke point and block it physically. The gate held longer than I expected. The angle iron uprights creaked. The anchors strained. But the bodies pushing weren't smart. They didn't coordinate. They pressed, then shifted, then pressed again. It wasn't like a battering ram. It was like waves against a fence. Then something changed. From behind the group, a new figure moved forward with more directness. It didn't drift. It navigated around bodies with purpose. It came to the front and grabbed the grate with both hands, shaking it hard. The vibration rippled down the uprights. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random. This one was responding to the barrier as a barrier, not thinking like a person, but more focused than the others. I'd seen something like this once before on a job site, not in a person, but in machinery. A pump that normally cavitates when it loses suction, but then suddenly catches pressure and starts moving fluid hard again. Same machine, different behavior because conditions changed. Okay, I whispered to myself, voice muffled by the mask. Not good. The focused one yanked again. One anchor bolt popped free with a sharp, metallic snap. The upright shifted. The gate was going to fail. I didn't wait for it. I moved quickly back to the valve control chamber and began building a hard block in the narrowest point. I rolled the steel drum into place, wedged the pipe flanges against it, and jammed the gearboxes into gaps. I used the angle iron as a brace across the top, tying it with chain links. Then I turned off all light and waited behind my makeshift barricade, crouched low, pistol ready, but kept down. The gate finally gave way with a groan and a crash that echoed like thunder. Footsteps, many, slapped water. Bodies stumbled forward into the corridor. Then the clinking started again as they hit the first chain barrier and the staged metal. They pushed. They fell. They rose. They kept coming. The focused one was among them. I could tell because the impacts became more deliberate, aimed at the corridor's weak points. I stayed motionless until I heard the first body collide with my second barricade. A heavy thump. Then hands scraped on the steel drum. The drum shifted half an inch. The brace groaned. This barricade wouldn't hold forever either. I needed an exit. Now, I had one. The valve control hatch to the collapsed shed, then out into the yard. But leaving the passage meant exposing myself to open ground and whatever was outside. Still, staying meant getting pinned underground with a crowd at both ends. I chose movement. I opened the valve control hatch slowly, inch by inch, controlling the wheel so it didn't screech. I listened. No immediate movement outside the shed. I slipped up the ladder, pushed the hatch wider, and climbed into the shed. Sunlight hit my eyes like a punch. The yard looked worse than yesterday. More vehicles. More figures moving between them. A small fire burned somewhere off to the left, producing a thin column of smoke. The air smelled like hot plastic and exhaust. I stayed low and moved through tall weeds, keeping the shed between me and the open road. I had to leave the facility entirely. If bodies kept entering the passage, they'd keep trying every hatch eventually. My hideout was turning into a funnel. I made it to the fence line, crouched behind an old concrete pad, and scanned for a route. Then I saw the worst sign possible. A figure stood near the entrance hatch area above ground, head tilted as if listening. Another figure joined it, then two more. They weren't random wanderers anymore. They were converging. Something about the passage, sound, airflow, maybe scent, was drawing them. I couldn't stay here, but I also couldn't just sprint into the city. So I did what my whole career had trained me to do: use infrastructure. On the facility map in my head, I remembered an old stormwater culvert that ran under the perimeter road and out toward a drainage channel feeding into the riverbank. It was meant for water, not people, but it was large enough to crawl through. I found it where I expected, half hidden behind brush, a round concrete mouth with damp stains and trash caught at the lip. It smelled like mud and algae, but it smelled like outside air. I checked it with my flashlight. No movement inside. I crawled in. The culvert was tight and filthy. My knees and elbows soaked through, but it led away from the yard, away from the hatches, away from the converging figures. Halfway through, I heard a distant metallic bang from behind. Maybe the valve control hatch being hit from below, maybe the barricade shifting. I didn't look back. After what felt like forever, the culvert opened into a drainage channel lined with rocks and weeds. The river wasn't far. The city skyline was visible through trees, but muted by haze and smoke. I stayed in the drainage channel and moved along it, keeping low. I needed a new shelter. Not a home, not a fortress, a temporary position that didn't advertise itself. My best option was a maintenance access under a nearby rail overpass, places I'd seen during surveys. Not comfortable, but solid, with limited entry points. I reached the underside of the overpass by late afternoon. The structure was concrete and steel, with thick columns and a narrow maintenance walkway behind a fence. The fence had a service panel locked with a cheap padlock. I cut it. Inside was a cramped, dry recess used for inspections. No power, no water, but it was out of sight. I could hear the world without being in it. I sat with my back against the concrete and finally let the shaking happen. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the delayed reaction of a body that had been running on decisions. I took off my respirator and breathed outside air fully for the first time since morning. Then, I did something that hurt more than the fear. I tried my phone again. One bar appeared. Just one. I typed fast. I'm alive. I left the pump station. I'm near a rail overpass by the river. Are you okay? I hit send. It hung for 2 seconds. Then it sent. A minute later, my phone buzzed so hard it almost made me drop it. A message from my sister. I'm okay. I'm with neighbors. Stay hidden. Don't come south. Bridge is blocked. I stared at the screen until my eyes watered. Then another message came in from my supervisor. If you're alive, reply. I'm heading to my brother's place outside the city. Don't stay downtown. I replied to both, short and clear, because long messages fail when networks collapse. Alive. Moving. Will update. Night fell. The city noise shifted into a different rhythm. Less traffic, more distant shouting, occasional sharp sounds that made my stomach tighten. I didn't go looking for what made them. I ate an energy bar slowly, drank treated water, and planned. I couldn't rebuild a fortress overnight. I couldn't reclaim the pump passage. That chapter was done. But what I'd built down there taught me something important. The outbreak wasn't just about strength. It was about systems. Barriers, airflow, sound, routes, layers, and exits. If I survived the next week, it would be because I treated survival like maintenance. Identify failure points before they fail, keep redundancy, and never trust a single component. The next morning, I moved again. I stayed near the river, using tree lines and drainage channels. I avoided crowds. I avoided any place with open doors and broken glass. I avoided the sound of generators because generators meant people, and people meant risk. By noon, I reached an area with low-rise industrial buildings and a small municipal maintenance yard. The gate was closed, but not secured properly. The office door was locked, but a side bay had a bent roll-up door that could be lifted enough to slip under. Inside, I found what I needed more than anything. A wall map, an old radio charger, and a laminated emergency contact sheet that listed a regional operations center outside the city. The radio itself was missing, but I knew what that meant. Someone had taken it recently, which meant people were still moving with purpose. I took the map, marked my route, and chose a direction that didn't require crossing the main bridges. Upstream, there were smaller crossings, service bridges, rail bridges. Risky, but possible. I moved toward one rail bridge that had a narrow maintenance walkway. I'd been on similar structures for inspections years ago. If it was intact, it could get me across without going through vehicle checkpoints or crowds. I reached the bridge at dusk. It was intact. The rails were clear, but the city on both sides looked damaged in that hazy, uncertain way, like the infrastructure was still standing but the human layer had peeled off. I crossed carefully, one hand on the railing, watching the water below, listening for movement behind me. Halfway across, I stopped and looked back towards the direction of the pump station. I couldn't see it from there, but I could imagine it. The hatches, the corridor, the gate that held until it didn't. The old report from 2009 warning people not to trust invisible air. That place had been shut down because it was too risky to operate. In the outbreak, risk had become the currency of every decision. I reached the far side and kept moving. I didn't know what the world would look like tomorrow. I didn't know if the network would stay alive long enough for another message. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done building a fortified hideout underground. From now on, I would build something better. A route. A routine. A way to stay alive without becoming trapped by my own walls. And if I ever had to go underground again, it wouldn't be because I was hiding. It would be because I had a plan to get back out. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.